The galaxy had seen a lot of wars. Oh, trust me, when you have been floating around the cosmos for as long as the Vethrani Collective has, you start to lose count. There was the siege of Dorvok Prime, where 17 species nearly destroyed a sun, arguing over mineral rights. There was the Pelosian Purge, which, honestly, nobody talks about anymore because it ended so embarrassingly for the Pelosians. And then there were the smaller skirmishes, the border disputes, the territorial sneezes that somehow escalated into full-blown interstellar incidents because somebody looked at somebody else's moon the wrong way. Wars, in the grand tradition of the universe, followed rules, understood rules. Rules so deeply embedded in the fabric of organized conflict that every spacefaring civilization from the outer rim to the core clusters knew them by heart. You overwhelm your enemy with superior firepower. You cut off their supply lines. You destroy their communication infrastructure. You demoralize their troops. Simple, clean, logical, and then humanity showed up. Now, I want to be very clear about something before we get into this because I think context matters enormously here. The Vethrani Collective is not by any measure a civilization that frightens easily. We have faced the Gorath swarm, which is essentially a billion-strong hive of carnivorous insects the size of ground vehicles, piloting ships made entirely from the bones of their previous enemies. We have negotiated with the Ulthek, who communicate exclusively through controlled bursts of radiation, and have, on multiple occasions, accidentally given our diplomats mild radiation poisoning simply by saying hello. We have done business with the Korathi, who have 17 genders and get violently offended if you only acknowledge 16 of them. We are not easily rattled. But humanity required a completely new category. The war itself started, as most wars involving humans seem to start, through a combination of miscommunication, bureaucratic incompetence, and someone being absolutely certain they were right when they were, demonstrably not. The Vethrani expansion fleet, under the command of High Admiral Saravok Dolturin, had claimed the Palessi Corridor, a stretch of deep space connecting 3 resource-rich star systems. Standard procedure: plant the flag, deploy the automated mining platforms, send a strongly worded message to anyone already using the area, and wait for them to leave. Except the humans did not leave. They sent back a message. It was, according to fleet linguist Orvesa Plan, technically polite. But only technically. The phrasing used by the human representative, one Captain Tomoko Adisa Reeves of the Terran Colonial Defense Force, translated roughly as, "Thank you for your communication. We have reviewed your claim. We find it legally creative, and we will be maintaining our current position." Fleet linguist Orvesa Plan later admitted she had spent 40 minutes staring at the phrase legally creative, trying to determine if it was a compliment. It was not a compliment. High Admiral Saravok Dolturin, a being who had won 6 military campaigns and possessed approximately zero sense of humor, dispatched 3 warships to make the humans reconsider their position. This was again standard procedure, show of force. The humans would see the superior tonnage, the weapons arrays, the gleaming hulls of Vethrani engineering, and they would reconsider being legally creative. The 3 warships arrived. The humans, somehow, some way, in a manner that still causes Vethrani tactical analysts to twitch involuntarily when discussing it, captured all 3 ships within 6 hours. Not destroyed, captured, intact, without, and this is the part that really gets people, a single human casualty. High Admiral Saravok Dolturin received the after-action report and sat in silence for 11 minutes. The report described how the humans had boarded the Vethrani vessels using something called a soft breach maneuver, which, it turned out, was not a recognized military tactic in any database the collective possessed. It was, as best the analysts could determine, something a human engineer named Femi Osei-Quarti had invented approximately 3 weeks prior using a modified atmospheric processor, and what the report diplomatically described as improvised mechanical components, and what was, in reality, a heavily reinforced cargo pallet with thrusters duct-taped to it. Duct tape, for those unfamiliar, is a human adhesive product. It has been in continuous use on Earth for over a century. It has been used to patch spacecraft. This is not a metaphor. Humans have genuinely, on multiple recorded occasions, used adhesive tape rated for household repairs to fix things operating in the vacuum of space. The High Admiral called a council. the council called for reinforcements. The reinforcements arrived in the form of Battle Group Vethrani 7, commanded by Sub-Admiral Palessi Corridor, who was young, ambitious, thoroughly convinced of his own brilliance, and had never fought humans before. This combination of qualities, in hindsight, was exactly as dangerous as it sounds. Sub-Admiral Palessi Corridor reviewed the previous engagement, identified what he believed were the tactical errors, constructed what he believed was a flawless counter-strategy, and deployed his 17 vessels in a formation specifically designed to prevent any repetition of the soft breach maneuver. The humans did not repeat the soft breach maneuver. They did something else entirely. What they did, according to the 17 separate debriefs collected afterward from traumatized Vethrani crew members, was this: they played music, not weapon systems, not jamming signals, music, loud music, broadcast on every available frequency, targeting the Vethrani fleet's communication arrays. The specific piece of music was later identified as something called Ride of the Valkyries, which is apparently a classical composition from a human composer named Wagner, who had been dead for over 140 years. The humans had modified the broadcast to loop continuously, increasing in volume every 30 seconds, and had somehow managed to synchronize it with their attack pattern, so that every torpedo fired, every flanking maneuver executed, every boarding action initiated, happened precisely on the beat. Sub-Admiral Palessi Corridor, in his debrief, described the experience as profoundly disorienting. His tactical officer, a decorated veteran named Vethrani Collective, described it as genuinely cosmically unhinged. The ship's psychological counselor, after sitting with the crew for several sessions, filed a report stating that 3 junior officers had started involuntarily humming the piece in their sleep and requested immediate reassignment. The battle itself, strategically speaking, was not even close. The humans dismantled Battle Group Vethrani 7 with a speed and efficiency that should have been terrifying on its own, completely separate from the musical accompaniment. But the music made it something else. It made it feel like humanity was enjoying themselves. And that, right there, is what nobody in the collective was prepared for. Because every other species the Vethrani had ever fought against was afraid during war. Determined, maybe. Disciplined, certainly. Brave in the way that beings are brave when they have no other options. But humans fought like the conflict was something they were actively interested in. Like they had been waiting for it. Like some portion of their very strange, very loud, very chaotic civilization had been quietly preparing for exactly this scenario, and was now finally getting to show everyone what they had been working on. Captain Tomoko Adisa Reeves, now in command of the combined captured Vethrani vessels, as well as her own colonial defense fleet elements, sent a second message to High Admiral Saravak Dolturin. Fleet linguist Orvesa Plan translated it. The message read, in its entirety, "We have your ships. They are in good condition. We would like to discuss the Palessi Corridor. We are available Tuesday." Tuesday is a unit of human time measurement. The Vethrani do not have Tuesdays. Orvesa Plan spent 30 minutes determining what a Tuesday was, then another 20 minutes trying to explain to the High Admiral that the humans were, apparently, willing to pause an active military conflict to observe their own calendar system. The High Admiral requested a glass of something strong and held the council for the second time. It was during this second council that someone first raised the possibility that the Vethrani Collective had made a significant error in tactical assessment. Not in the execution of the war, necessarily. In the fundamental premise. Every civilization that had ever gone to war with humanity had gone in expecting to fight beings who thought like other beings. Beings who understood attrition and resource limitation, and the psychological weight of casualties, and the logical endpoint of a conflict where one side had superior numbers and superior technology. Humans, it turned out, did not weight these things the way other species did. A Vethrani force with superior numbers was, to a human commander, not a reason to retreat. It was, apparently, a more interesting problem. More interesting problems produced more creative solutions. More creative solutions produced things like Femi Ose-Quarte and his cargo pallet with thrusters duct taped to it. Intelligence Coordinator Yabra F. Pellis, who had spent 11 years studying human civilization and was generally regarded as the foremost Vethrani expert on Terran behavior, stood up at the council and said something that would be quoted in military analysis documents for the next 200 years. She said, "The problem is not that humans are reckless. The problem is that they have calculated the acceptable cost of victory differently than we have, and their calculation is correct. Nobody liked hearing that. But everyone in that room understood exactly what she meant. Because the numbers were there, in the tactical reports, cold and undeniable. Humans had retaken the Palessi Corridor. Humans had captured 20 vessels. Humans had done it with laughable resources compared to what the Collective had deployed, using technology that was, by objective measurement, decades behind Vethrani engineering. And through all of it, through every engagement, every boarding action, every frequency filled with a dead man's orchestra, the human forces had communicated with each other in ways that Vethrani signal analysts still could not fully decode. Not because the encryption was sophisticated, because the humans kept using idioms. The idiom problem deserves its own dedicated moment of appreciation, because it genuinely broke 3 separate Vethrani intelligence teams before anyone figured out what was happening. The first team assigned to decode human battlefield communications lasted 2 weeks before their senior analyst, a meticulous and deeply serious being named Korith Valsene, submitted a resignation letter citing irreconcilable differences with the English language. The second team lasted slightly longer, mostly because they brought in a xenolinguistic specialist from the Outer Reach universities who had written her doctoral thesis on human communication patterns. Her name was Druska Pelavaran, and she was, by all accounts, the smartest person in any room she entered. Druska Pelavaran lasted 19 days. Her final report before requesting reassignment contained a 17-page appendix dedicated entirely to the phrase "bite the bullet," which human soldiers used with alarming frequency during combat situations. Druska had initially flagged it as a reference to ammunition consumption, then as a dental-related injury report protocol, then, after consulting 6 separate databases, as a human ritual involving the literal ingestion of projectile weaponry as a courage-building exercise. None of these were correct. It meant, apparently, to do something difficult without complaining. Why, Druska asked in her report, in the name of every star in the core clusters, would a species facing actual projectile weapons in actual combat choose that specific metaphor? Nobody had an answer for her. The third team took a different approach. They stopped trying to understand the idioms and simply cataloged them. The catalog, after 30 days of active monitoring, contained over 400 distinct phrases that human soldiers used in combat situations, which meant something entirely different from what the words suggested. Break a leg was encouragement. It's raining cats and dogs was a weather observation with no animal content whatsoever. Bite off more than you can chew, which appeared frequently in communications between Captain Tomoko Adisa Reeves and her subordinates, was apparently a warning about overextension, not a dietary concern. Intelligence Coordinator Yabra Eth Pellis reviewed the catalog, added it to her already considerable file on human behavioral anomalies, and went back to the High Admiral with an updated assessment. The assessment was blunt. The Vethrani Collective, Yabra explained, had been attempting to fight humans the way you fight a conventional military force, predict their movements, overwhelm their logistics, target their command structure. These were sound principles that worked reliably against every other spacefaring civilization in the known galaxy, because every other spacefaring civilization in the known galaxy operated on a foundation of rational self-preservation weighted against acceptable risk. Humans, Yabra said, had a different foundation entirely. She pulled up a piece of human historical data she had been sitting on for months, waiting for the right moment. It was a record from a conflict on the human homeworld, centuries before they had ever reached space, in which a vastly outnumbered human force had held a defensive position against overwhelming odds for days, suffering catastrophic losses, not because they believed they could win, but because someone had decided that holding the position mattered more than surviving it. The humans lost that battle. They remembered it as one of their greatest moments. The High Admiral stared at the record for a long time. Then he asked the question that, to be fair, needed asking. Are they insane? Yabra Eth Pellis considered the question carefully. No, she said, they're sentimental. This distinction, subtle as it sounds, was everything. Because insane enemies are unpredictable in ways you can eventually map. Sentimental enemies are unpredictable in ways that are tied to a value system you have to understand before you can anticipate anything. And humanity's value system, it turned out, included things that no Vethrani military strategist had ever had to account for before. Things like unit cohesion built not around efficiency metrics, but around personal relationships. Things like soldiers who fought harder when someone they cared about was in danger than when their own survival was at stake. Things like a human commander named Lieutenant Bako Mensa Ofosu, who during the third engagement in the Palessi Corridor had piloted a damaged shuttle directly into the hangar bay of a Vethrani cruiser, not because it was the tactically optimal move, but because 3 members of his crew were trapped on the other side, and he was not. He had apparently stated very loudly over open comms, leaving without them. Lieutenant Bako Mensa Ofosu survived this. His crew survived this. The Vethrani cruiser did not have a good afternoon. The report on that engagement included a sensor log of Bako's shuttle impact and the subsequent 13 minutes of absolute mayhem that one human lieutenant with a broken arm, a malfunctioning sidearm, and what the report described as an extraordinary tolerance for personal injury inflicted on a fully crewed Vethrani warship before his teammates reached him. Vethrani tactical analyst Soren Duvashkel, reviewing the log, had written in the margin, in handwriting that suggested emotional distress, "This should not be possible." He underlined it twice. The collective called for a ceasefire, not a surrender. The Vethrani do not surrender, as a cultural point of pride that had served them well across centuries of expansion. But a ceasefire, a pause, a moment to breathe and reassess, was something different, something practical. High Admiral Saravak Dol Turin, to his considerable credit, was a being who could update his assessment when the evidence demanded it, and the evidence was now demanding it loudly, in 4/4 time, with a full orchestra. The ceasefire request was transmitted to Captain Tomoko Adisa Reeves. Her response arrived 40 minutes later. Fleet linguist Orvesa Plan translated it, then read it twice, then went and got herself a beverage before delivering it to the High Admiral. Captain Adisa Reeves agreed to the ceasefire. She proposed a location for negotiations. She included, at the bottom of the message, a sentence that Orvesa translated carefully, and then delivered verbatim, because she felt the exact wording mattered. "We look forward to sitting down with you. We brought snacks." The High Admiral asked what snacks were. Orvesa explained that snacks were small food items humans brought to social occasions as a gesture of friendliness and good intent. The High Admiral sat with this information for a moment. "They brought food," he said, "to a war negotiation." "Yes," said Orvesa. "After defeating 20 of our vessels." "Yes. And capturing 3 others." 23 vessels, sir. There were 3 more taken in the Mensa Ofosu incident. The High Admiral closed his eyes briefly. They brought snacks. The negotiations took place on a neutral platform in the outer edge of the Palessi Corridor. The Vethrani delegation arrived in formal diplomatic configuration, full regalia, the ceremonial gravity of a civilization that had been conducting interstellar diplomacy for 400 years. They were prepared for tense exchanges, calculated silences, the slow, grinding architecture of 2 powers finding acceptable middle ground. The human delegation arrived 17 minutes late, apologized cheerfully, and set out a container of something called mixed nuts on the negotiating table. Sub-Admiral Prethik Osavane, who had insisted on attending despite his earlier defeat because he felt he had learned important lessons and wanted to demonstrate personal growth, stared at the mixed nuts for a full minute. He later described them as unexpectedly compelling. The lead human negotiator was not Captain Adisa Reeves, who remained with the fleet. It was a civilian diplomat named Rafaela Bouchard-Osei, who was small, pleasant, spoke with her hands constantly, and had, according to her file, negotiated 7 previous interstellar agreements, and once talked a Karathi trade delegation out of declaring war over a misunderstanding involving 17 genders and a seating chart. Rafaela Bouchard-Osei sat down across from the Vethrani delegation, smiled warmly, and said, "Let's figure this out." What followed was not what anyone on the Vethrani side had expected. They had expected demands, territorial claims, resource percentages, the language of victory imposed on the defeated. Instead, Rafaela Bouchard-Osei asked questions, genuine questions, about what the Palessi Corridor meant to the collective, about the mining operations, about the supply chain implications. She took notes. She nodded. She said, "That makes sense," with an earnestness that Intelligence Coordinator Yabra Eth Pellis, observing from the back of the room, found genuinely difficult to process. Because it did make sense, Humans were not. Yabra was realizing with a sensation she could only describe as vertigo, exclusively the beings who duct-taped thrusters to cargo pallets and played classical music during fleet engagements. They were also this. Also Rafaela, with her notes and her questions and her container of mixed nuts that Sub-Admiral Prithik Osavane had now quietly eaten half of. They were both things simultaneously. A species that would follow a wounded lieutenant through a destroyed hangar bay and also sit down at a table and ask, sincerely, what you needed. A civilization that calculated acceptable losses differently than anyone else, and also showed up 17 minutes late with snacks because they wanted the room to feel less hostile. Warriors who filled combat frequencies with a dead composer's orchestra, and diplomats who said that makes sense and meant it. Yabra wrote in her personal notes that evening, "We have been classifying humanity as a military phenomenon. This is incorrect. They are a social phenomenon that happens to be extremely difficult to kill." The agreement that emerged from those negotiations surprised everyone, including, based on their expressions, several members of the human delegation. The Palessi Corridor would be jointly administered. Vethrani mining operations on 2 of the 3 systems would continue, with Terran oversight on safety standards, which humans had opinions about. Human colonial expansion would proceed on the 3rd system, with access lanes kept clear for Vethrani supply routes. A joint communication protocol would be established, which would include, at Rafaela Bouchard-Osei's specific request, a glossary of common human idioms to prevent future intelligence translation incidents. The glossary was 43 pages long. Korith Val Sena, the analyst who had resigned over Bite the Bullet, was reportedly sent a copy. He framed it, not as a trophy. He has stated in subsequent interviews that he keeps it on his wall as a reminder that some things in the universe simply require acceptance rather than understanding. High Admiral Saravak Dol Turin signed the agreement. He did so with the formal gravity appropriate to his rank and the occasion. Then, because Rafaela Bouchard-Osei asked him to, he tried a mixed nut. He did not, in the official record, indicate his opinion of the mixed nut. Yabra Eth Pellis, who was watching, noted that he reached for a second one. The Palessi Accord, as it came to be known, lasted, not because both sides had equal military power, though the collective spent considerable resources updating their tactical assessments after the war to account for human unpredictability. Not because the terms were perfectly balanced, though Rafaela had done remarkable work. It lasted because humanity had done something in that conflict that no other species had thought to do in the history of Vethrani expansion. They had made the collective curious about them. Every other species the Vethrani had ever fought had become, after conflict, a known quantity. A problem solved, catalogued, filed. Humans, after the Palessi Corridor incident, became something the collective's finest minds wanted to understand, and that, it turned out, was far more durable than any treaty. Lieutenant Bako Mensa Ofosu was eventually awarded the Terran Colonial Defense Cross for his actions in the 3rd engagement. At the ceremony, he gave a speech that was, by human standards, short. He said he had done what anyone would do. The Vethrani attaché present at the ceremony, a young diplomat on his first assignment, sent a report back to the collective stating that he believed the lieutenant genuinely meant this. The report caused considerable discussion. Captain Tomoko Adisa Reeves returned to active duty in the Palessi Corridor, now overseeing joint operations. She and Vethrani Fleet Coordinator Veltha Marsokan, who had described the musical attack as genuinely, cosmically unhinged, developed a working relationship that their respective governments described as productive and both of them described as interesting. Femi Osei Quarte, the engineer who had invented the soft breach maneuver using a cargo pallet and duct tape, submitted a formal patent application for the design. The application was approved. He later sold the licensing rights and used the proceeds to open a small restaurant on the 3rd Palessi system planet, which, within 18 months became inexplicably popular with Vethrani mining crews. He served mixed nuts, and somewhere out in the deep dark between the stars, in the spaces where the old wars are remembered and the new ones are quietly being considered, every spacefaring civilization with any intelligence apparatus worth the name updated their files on humanity, added new sections, flagged new variables, tried, once again, to build a model that could account for a species that fought with duct tape and classical music, and then showed up to the ceasefire with snacks. The models were never quite right. They never are. That, more than any weapon, more than any tactical innovation or military doctrine, is what changed interstellar war forever. Not that humanity was the strongest, not even that they were the strangest. It was that you could never quite finish the file.